I walk Amos, our son, to school on Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays, and we always say the Lord's Prayer together. And then after that, we go down into Woodland Walk, and you often see dog walkers. And while we're walking along and I'm holding his hand, we usually see these dogs. And if I see a little rat dog, you know the kind I'm talking about, the kind like the Bacon family in the church have just bought, those kind of things that you think, is it a dog, is it a rat? I'm not really sure. It's got a lead on, probably is a dog. When we see those, I say to him, watch out, it's a wolf. And they like eating little chubby 8-year-old boys. And he looks at me as if, Dad, come on, it's not a wolf. And he will say, it's not a wolf. And often the person walking their dog will kind of grin at him as if to say, yeah, you're right, it's not a wolf. But wolves are things that we've been accustomed to be scared of. They're seldom seen in the light. They come out at night, they take their prey in the evening. J.G. Wood says in his book, Story of the Bible Animals, individually, the wolf is a rather timid animal. It will avoid a man or a woman. He wrote this a couple of 100 years ago, so forgive the terminology, rather than meet him. It prefers to steal upon its prey and take it unawares, rather than to seize it openly and boldly. It is ever suspicious of treachery and is always imagining that a trap is laid for it. Even the shallow device of a few yards of rope trailing from an object or a strip of cloth fluttering in the breeze is quite sufficient to keep the wolf at bay for considerable time. This fact is well known to hunters who are accustomed to secure the body of a slain deer by simply tying a strip of cloth to its horn. If taken in a trap of any kind, or even if it fancies itself in an enclosure from which it can find no egress, it loses all courage and will submit to be killed without offering the least resistance. It will occasionally endeavour to effect its escape by feigning death, and has more than once been known to succeed in this device. They hunt together in packs, wolves, and although they are feeble in some ways, there is not one animal that they will not decide to attack. Human beings, they will take the odd child, maybe an elderly lady, if they have the chance. In France, between about 1300 and 1960, 7,600 people were said to have been killed by wolves. In half term, I read The Call of the Wild by Jack London. I did it kind of in preparation for this talk, but I have to tell you, it's an absolutely blindingly brilliant, in my opinion, book. It's only about 120 pages long. It was written over 100 years ago, but it is fantastic. It talks about this dog, Buck, who is pampered and lord of the manor and gets away with anything. And he is taken, snatched, and taken up north for the gold rush in Alaska. And the story develops as Buck is beaten and as Buck is trained to be a sledge dog. And what I find interesting is that as Buck becomes a liar, as Buck becomes a thief to steal animals, food from other dogs, as Buck becomes ferocious to dominate the pack, the way that Jack London describes those changes is to describe him as becoming more wolf-like. In Jack London's mind, to become those negative things is to become wolf-like. Buck changes as the story develops. I'm not going to spoil the end for you. I encourage you to read it or to watch the film with Harrison Ford that came out last year. Wolves, we have a confused picture about them. Jesus paints it really clearly. In Matthew chapter 7, he says the following things. Let's watch our Bible reading together.
Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them.
Wolves are mentioned in the Bible, but not in the same way as bears and dogs and lions, where they are actual creatures that we interact with. Wolves are always used in a symbolic way to express ferociousness and deceit. And Jesus says that in our reading. Right at the beginning in verse 15, he says, "Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious animals." And here's another version of that passage. It's from the Message version of the Bible. And Jesus says, "Be wary of false preachers who smile a lot, dripping with practiced sincerity. Chances are they are out to rip you off some way or other." Don't be impressed with their charisma. Look for character. Who preachers are is the main thing, not what they say. A genuine leader will never exploit your emotions or your pocketbook. These diseased trees with their bad apples are going to be chopped down and burned. Jonestown. Have you heard of it? Jonestown is the People's Temple Agricultural Project. It was a remote settlement in Guyana, and it was established by the People's Temple. It was a San Francisco church to begin with, just a normal church full of normal people doing things in, for and with their local community as they worshipped God together. But it became a cult under the leadership of Jim Jones, who we see here on our screens. It became internationally known in November of 1978, on the 18th, when 918 people committed mass suicide. Why? Because Jim Jones told them to. He told them that the American government were out to get them, which they weren't. And so his henchmen, his deacons, his elders, stood watch as men, women, and little children drank Kool-Aid with poison in it. And then so did he. This is what can happen when preachers with their practiced sincerity get too involved in our lives, when they become wolves in sheep's clothing. I remember preaching at a church somewhere, sometime in the past, and I was a guest speaker. And one of the elders of this church was leading the service. And as he led, I felt increasingly uncomfortable. And I thought, there is something manipulative about this man that I do not trust. But because I'm English, maybe, I ignored that. Several months later, and I say this with no satisfaction, I say it with sadness, it was found that he had been manipulating and abusing many, many people in his position of power in that church and in that town. We need to be wary of wolves in sheep's clothing. A couple of phrases jumped out at me as I read about wolves in these last couple of weeks. One was this, that wolves are successful from the tropics to Arctic in almost any terrain. They can get anywhere. And Simon Barnes, in The History of the World in 100 Animals, says the idea that there is something out there trying to get us has always been part of the human condition. The wolves play an enormous part in that fear. Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? A question still asked to this day. From the tropics to the Arctic, they are in almost every terrain, and wolves in sheep clothing can get into any and every place. Jesus in Luke chapter 10 verse 3 says to the disciples, "I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves." He knows that the world, as well as being beautiful, can be a dangerous place, and so too can the church be. That's why we have things like DBS checks. That's why we only let people work with children and vulnerable adults who we know, as every church should do, and who we trust and who we've checked out with the police. It's not because we don't like people, it's because we know that wolves in sheep clothing can get into church, into youth groups. And you know that as well, don't you? You maybe have even experienced that. Church, as well as being exciting and full of adventure, should be the safest place where we can entrust our children and our parents and our grandparents to, knowing that they will be looked after and loved. No room for wolves in sheep's clothing. Another phrase that grabbed me was this about wolves. They aren't great sprinters, but run down prey over long distances. Just this idea that they will keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. They're in it for the long haul. And wolves in sheep's clothing in a church context will lay low, long and hard, until their opportunity comes. And so we should be vigilant. I find it interesting that in John chapter 2, verse 24, Jesus said that he didn't entrust himself to the crowds, for he knew all people. When I first heard my father-in-law, Derek Hills, preach on that when I was a teenager, I was shocked because he said something like this. I don't know, it's probably 3 points in a poem, but they were good. But he said, basically, Jesus didn't trust everyone, and nor should we. I thought, well, hang on a minute. We're Christians, aren't we? Shouldn't we just trust absolutely everyone? And over the years, I've come to see that what he said, I think, is true. That we should be wise about who we entrust our lives to. Your heart, your soul, your mind, your life is precious to God. You are his daughter, his son. And so we would do well to be careful about who we entrust our lives to. Because these wolves in sheep's clothing are in it for the long haul, and they will keep going and keep going and keep going. And we need to be wary of them. When I was with Megan, my oldest daughter, at an Arsenal match, and she was a bit younger than in this photo, her first game, we were sat above the Everton fans and we were singing to them, "Who are you? Who are you? Who are you?" Because we were winning. It was our way of saying to them, "You're nobody. Our team is brilliant." Oh, how I long for those days. And Megan turned and looked at me and said, "Daddy, are we trying to make friends with them?" And I said, "No, Megan, we're just saying, who are you?" Challenging their team. When it comes to leaders in our life in a church context, whether that be a minister or a home group leader or a youth leader or someone who heads up our day centre, someone who hands out bags of food at the door, we should be asking all the time, who are you? Who are you? What is your character like? Didn't you see earlier in that reading, in Eugene Peterson's Message version of it, that he said it's not about what preachers say, it's about who they are that we should be looking at. Don't be impressed with charisma, look for character. What is character? Character is your personality, your temperament, your morals. I'm wary if I'm around people who are always losing their rag. We all get angry from time to time. We don't hit our thumb with a hammer and say, "Oh, praise the Lord, thank you for this learning point, Jesus." We do get angry. But if I'm around someone who's always getting angry, someone who's always saying, "Oh, I'm only human," and morally continually failing, then the alarm bell should be going. My heart, soul and mind, my life is precious to God, and I should entrust it wisely to others, not to wolves in sheep's clothing. Aesop's fable is another thing that came up as I was reading about wolves this week, and the boy who cried wolf. Do you remember that? Keeps telling the village, there's a wolf, and they go and look for it, and it's not there. And then the one time the wolf is there, none of them go out and help the young lad. Some of us, as we've been listening to this talk, have felt really guilty. And we felt guilty because we've been duped by a wolf in sheep's clothing in our lives. We've been abused mentally, physically, spiritually, sexually by one of these wolves in sheep's clothing. And so this talk has been really painful for you to listen to because you felt foolish. Because maybe you were told, well, actually, you just cried wolf. And so you went through those days, weeks, months, years of a wolf in sheep's clothing having control in your life, and there was nothing that you felt you could do about it. My friend, these sheep-shaped wolves abused you And that was not your fault. It wasn't. It's one of the dark parts of life that they will get in and they will hunt us down and they will have their way if they can. You didn't cry wolf. You didn't make a big thing out of nothing. You were right to speak up and right to desire and seek justice. It was no fable. It was your life. An old Cherokee was talking to his grandson, and he said, "A fight is going on inside me. It is a terrible fight, and it is between two wolves. One is evil. He is anger, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, self-doubt and ego. The other wolf is good. He is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith." The same fight is going on inside you and inside every other person too. The grandson then asked his grandfather, "Which wolf will win?" The old chief simply replied, "The one you feed." The one you feed. So which one are we feeding inside us? Because pretty much all of us worshipping together today are leaders in some way, shape or form. At church, at work, at school, in our home, in our neighbourhood. And if we're not careful, we can be wolves in sheep's clothing. If we feed that negative side, and we need to be aware of where that could lead us. Let's feed the good side by looking at the Lamb that was slain, Jesus. The Lamb who went before wolves and hung on that cross and died for all of us so that we could be sheep of his pasture rather than wolves in sheep's clothing. Friends, let's avoid wolves in sheep's clothing and let's make sure we jolly well don't become them either.